morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're at. I'd like to welcome you to our 2022 Buddhist Churches of America Civic Seminar, hosted by the Institute of Buddhist Studies, the Jodo Shinshu International Office, and BCA Center for Buddhist Education. As many of you know, this is our first live hybrid Pacific seminar since we've reopened the Jodo Shinshu Center. So I'd especially like to thank Koichi Mizushima, Judy Kono of CBE, Madeline Kubo of JSIO, Bob Matsueda, and Pam Matsuoka of BCA for working so hard behind the scenes to allow us to do this seminar. We don't have a lot of people here live yet, but we have over 150 people registered throughout the US and other parts of the world. So hopefully you'll all enjoy today's seminar. So I'd like to begin by introducing our speakers for today, Dr. Melissa Curley and Dr. Aaron Profett. And the moderator will be Reverend Dr. Takashi Miyaji of the Institute of Buddhist Studies and Southern Alameda Buddhist Temple. Dr. Curley is an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Studies at Ohio State and the author of Pure Land, Real World, Modern Buddhism, Japanese Leftists, and the Utopian Imagination. Today she'll be speaking on how Pure Land thinkers in Japan made room for the Western paradise in the modern world. What elements of Pure Land tradition do they hope to hang on to, and what do they think should be left behind? What kind of world did they think was possible, and how did the world react to their ideas? Following Dr. Curley, Dr. Profett was an assistant professor of Japanese studies at the University of Albany, State University of New York. His research focuses on 12th and 13th century Japanese Buddhism and in the context of broader East Asian and Mahayana theories of ritual speech, such as mantras, spells, etc., the afterlife, and debates the relationship between Buddhist practice and the attainment of enlightenment. He is also interested in how Buddhist modernism and contemporary sectarian discourse influences how we understand pre-modern Buddhist thought and practice. So this morning we'll begin with Dr. Curley, who will speak for about 45 minutes, followed by question and answers moderated by Reverend Miyaji. Then Dr. Profett will present, followed by questions and answers from Reverend Miyaji. Then we'll take a 1-hour lunch break, and in the afternoon, we'll continue with both Dr. Curley and Dr. Profett's talks. So thank you all for joining us.
It's very exciting to be back with people again, and what an auspicious way to re-enter the public world. I'm so grateful for this invitation and so thankful to everybody who's joining us here in person and virtually. I see lots of old friends and new friends on the Zoom, so thank you all for being here. Let me get right into it. One of the many things I have lost over the course of the pandemic is my ability to manage time. So I can already tell this is going to be one of those terrible situations where a person gets to the point of having a 5-minute warning and they say, okay, just 30 pages left. I'll just skip some pages. Okay. So the challenge for me today is to go back to a time period that I'm familiar with, which is the turn of the century, not the most recent turn of the century, but the last turn of the century, from the 19th into the 20th. In Japan, that's a time and place that I've thought about a lot and done some work on. But instead of going to my old favorites, who are thinkers on the Otani side, I'm challenged and given the opportunity to think about folks on the Hongwanji side and Nishi Hongwanji thinkers. So that has been just a wonderful chance for me. And I'll tell you a little bit about, some of the thinkers that stand out to me as among the most interesting in that intellectual world. Let me start though. I have a PowerPoint to help me along. Let me try to share that with you. It's saying the host has disabled participant screen sharing. Maybe I need to be made a host. Oh, sure. Great. Okay, so let me just open this up and see. Yeah, okay, so here's a little slide to keep me honest. So I'm going to try to talk about the context for some of the cultural transformations that were taking place in the larger Japanese world that impacted Shinshu, not all of them, but some of them. And then share my own thoughts on some of the elements of the Shinshu vision of the world that were really impacted by these transformations, where people started to ask some questions. And then I'll, spend some time talking about some of the different ways in which we see Nishi thinkers drawing very skillfully and creatively on the resources that they have to answer those questions. And one of the things that's interesting is the range of possibilities, the very diverse kinds of ideas that we see coming out of this intellectual tradition. So the context, I'll talk about sort of 3 or 4 different changes that take place that have an impact. So the first one that I'm illustrating here with a diagram, and I guess a different kind of diagram, are really changing conceptions of the cosmos. So we see a shift from a vision of the cosmos as centered around this mountain, Mount Sumeru, which is shown in the left-hand image, as a kind of blue mountain surrounded by seas and mountain ranges. And we are supposed to be, as human beings, on one of these continents floating in this cosmic sea. So this is a mandalic kind of cosmos that is a very organized kind of cosmos with very clear boundaries and a very clear relationship to other microcosmic structures like the human being, for example. Now, this is a universe in which the Western Pure Land exists. We know exactly where it exists. And if we follow kind of Indian ways of thinking, we can even calculate the distance between where we are on our continent and the western edge of the universe. That cosmos starts to become disrupted even in the 17th century with the introduction different ways of thinking about the universe as organized in terms of the solar system as we know it today. And there's a period of time in which Japanese Buddhists are able to kind of keep that vision of the cosmos at the margins. But in the 19th century, it becomes impossible for them to do that. And indeed, some of them don't want to do that. They're really interested in science and interested in understanding the universe in a scientific way. So this vision of Mount Meru is displaced by a vision that we're seeing in the woodcut on the right, someone instructing 2 young women and another man. This is actually what the solar system looks like. And we are on a planet that is circling the sun. So we have this new vision of what the cosmos is like. That's accompanied by an effort to very conscious effort in the 19th century to start taking gods and spirits out of the picture. So where in pre-modern Japan, people lived in a world that was very full of different kinds of powerful, maybe invisible beings. In the 19th century and into the 20th, people really start to go on in a very concerted way to explain or convince people the world is not full of magical beings. The world is not full of supernatural powers. This is a scientific world, a material world, and we can understand rationally everything that happens in it. So that's a big change. There's also a big change going on in terms of kind of more down-to-earth geography. So people are starting to think in Japan about how Japan relates to the Asian continent. Because people are newly able to travel to the Asian continent. One of the most important kind of groups of travelers, in fact, going to Asia to explore the Buddhist world and bring some of that Asian world back to Japan is led by a Nishi Hongwanji temple son who would become the abbot. So we see him here in inset as a young man. He sponsored and participated in these expeditions to go gather Buddhist archaeological material on the continent, traveling all the way to India. And then when he became abbot and was not able to participate himself anymore, he continued to fund those expeditions. So he's really at the heart of a new vision of Japan as part of a bigger Asian world of Buddhism. Maybe we'll hear a bit more about this kind of new understanding of Japanese Buddhism as part of a religion called Buddhism from here and later. And he's also, like other young people at that time, interested in Europe. So Japanese Buddhists are also starting to think about themselves, like Japanese people generally, in relation to the West, in relation to Europe and the United States. So different sense of where they are in the world, and a different understanding of themselves as having this kind of cosmopolitan possibilities. So that sense of geography is changing. There's also a changing sense of what's going on inside the body. So whereas for the pre-modern person, it seems clear from the text that people thought of the body as a sort of very porous container that had the same material inside that was present in the universe outside. So there's a kind of substance, an energetic substance we call chi, that's flowing from the outside to the inside and from the inside back again. And we see in the diagram on the left a picture of the body that is like that. And you can see how what part of what that involves is thinking of the body as a kind of small version of a country or a small version of a universe, right? In very close relationship to all of the flowing energies that exist outside of the body. That changes when people start to learn instead to think of the body not as an energetic system, but as organized in terms of a nervous system. And the body now becomes sort of ideally a closed envelope. You can look inside of it, but what you find is not something that's also present in the outside world. Instead, you find this organized system of organs. That comes along with a kind of parallel sense that if you look inside of the spiritual body, you find a self, find this personality that's just yours, a private world in which your real self exists and can be developed through self-reflection. That's a very similar kind of interiority that we have, I think, imaginatively today. So it's important to know that that's not that old. People had to learn to think of themselves as having this private inner world of the self that could be developed and should be developed and was not contingent on what was going on in the outside world. And that comes too with a change in the idea of what is desirable for the full cultivation of that inner world. And Japanese folks, like people elsewhere in the world, start to think of this in terms of a notion of freedom. So there's an earlier idea of freedom, of course, right? In Buddhism, in the Buddhist tradition, we know there's an idea of liberation, which seems clearly related to the modern notion of freedom. But if we look back at the pre-modern sources, liberation is usually talked about in terms of a kind of freedom from some sort of problem. So a freedom from ignorance or a freedom from suffering. And the question of what exists after that freedom is attained is not the question of primary interest. Freedom is really about becoming liberated from ignorance, suffering, and perhaps from this world. And for modern people, they get a couple of new terms that feel related to liberation, but have some different nuances. So one term that they're playing around with is a term that we can translate as self-mastery. So freedom means being in charge of yourself, being the authority. Whereas in the pre-modern world, it makes sense that everything is organized by a lord who gives you the authority to act or not to act. Now to be a human being means you have the authority. You're the final authority. You say whether you act or don't act. So that's an idea of freedom as self-mastery. And then there's also a freedom, an idea of freedom as having the sense that in this world inside of you, there's a will or an intention. And freedom means that you can follow that intention without restriction. So being free means being able to hear and understand what your own will desires, and then to go after it in the world. So these ideas of freedom are thought of as really essential both to cultivating a self that is appropriate to the modern period, and also being able to be a good citizen. So in the modern period, instead of being just a subject of a lord, now you're supposed to be a citizen, a member of a society who participates and contributes and makes decisions. Well, you have to cultivate yourself in order to be able to do that effectively. So cultivating your freedom is also a way of becoming able to participate fully in this new social world. So this all probably sounds more or less familiar, the sort of ways of thinking about what the world is all about. If I think about 19th century Japan and 21st century North America, those worlds for me still feel pretty familiar. That world feels pretty familiar. But for 19th century Shinshu thinkers, there are some sticking points. So what are some of the elements of the Shinshu vision of the world that were impacted by these cultural transformations? You can probably guess what some of the important impacts are. For some Shinshu thinkers, the question of where Amida's Western paradise is located becomes very pressing. And I think we'll see in discussions later today that it has always been a question. There's not a clear moment in the Shin intellectual tradition where it's obvious to everyone where it's located. It's always been an interesting question, but it becomes in the 19th century, early 20th century, a question that feels very important to answer. So if you don't understand the universe as centered around Mount Sumeru with a clear Western edge, is there room in this new map of the universe for the Pure Land to exist? What is the space that it occupies? And if there is no space on the map for the Pure Land, where will we put it? For some Shinshu thinkers, as they're kind of moving into this world that's not occupied anymore by gods and spirits, the question of how to distinguish Amida Buddha from supernatural powers also becomes very pressing. So if you are saying in this world, what people used to call ghosts, or what they used to call serpent deities, what they used to call dragons, we don't think these things exist. Amida also is a presence in this world. In the pre-modern Japanese imagination, Amida is coming into this world for sure all the time. So what kind of power is he? If he's not the kind of power that only superstitious people believe in, what makes him different? Can he still come into this world if this world is not a world of magic and enchantment? This is important in the Shinshu context, in part because we see very clearly in pre-modern Shinshu that human teachers were understood as incarnations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. That includes Honen, who was understood as an incarnation of the Bodhisattva of wisdom. It includes Shinran, who was understood as an incarnation of the Bodhisattva of compassion, and also Amida Buddha himself. So this is a question to be settled or to be discussed. And then for some Shinshu thinkers, the question of Shinran's own existence becomes a really pressing one. So as they're encountering Asia and starting to think in new ways about Shinshu as part of a larger Buddhist tradition that goes back to an original Buddhism and to the historical Buddha, lots of Japanese Buddhist thinkers in the modern period feel prepared to say that the historical Buddha was actually just a person, just a human being, an ordinary human being. For Shin thinkers, is it also okay to say that Shinran was just an ordinary person? Is it okay to say that Shinran was a human being and not a transformation body and not an avatar, not a presence of Amida Tathagata in the world? Other thinkers, this is surprising, it follows an effort to understand Buddhism historically. The claim that the historical Buddha was just a person is also a way of saying he really did exist. He's not made up, he's a real human being who existed. Well, so there are some thinkers who entertain the possibility that maybe Shinran, who's described as an emanation body or an incarnation body, maybe Shinran didn't exist. Maybe not only was he not a supernatural presence, maybe he wasn't even a human being. So some people are thinking, well, maybe the founder did not exist. And as a tradition, what will we do with that? At the same time, this is a different kind of possibility. It's not a question for discussion so much as it's opening up a new interpretive mode. Some of you might know this already. Before the modern period, the text of the Tanisho was not widely available. It was supposed to be a secret text. People were not reading Tanisho. But at the turn of the century, for a number of different reasons, the Tanisho starts to circulate quite widely. Ordinary practitioners are reading it, ordinary followers are reading it, and even people who have no particular relationship to Shinshu are reading it. The Tanisho, as you know, I'm sure all of you know, is a very different kind of text from both the doctrinal weightiness of Jodo Shinshu and then the emotional, inspiring hymns, right? It's a very different way of thinking with and encountering Shinran. But lots of people are reading Tanisho. And separate from the question of whether Shinran was a supernatural presence in the world, they are, through this small book, really encountering him in a very personal way. There's lots of people at the turn of the century who are writing about having a small copy of the Tanisho, and they keep it by their pillow at night. And when they wake up, they open Tanisho and read just a couple of pages of Tanisho. That's a very intimate way of encountering the Shinran who appears for us in that text. So that's giving this new way of thinking about Shinran as very human, the most kind of human-y of human beings. So there are questions that are coming up, and then there are these new possibilities that are emerging out of that. So we see lots of kinds of responses to these sticking points, efforts to negotiate them, or even to kind of use them to propel Shinshu forward into the modern age from these young thinkers, mostly young thinkers. They have in common, it seems to me, an approach that really resonates with something that Paco was saying last night. I think, are you here, Paco? Hi. So you were talking about, it was so striking to me, you were talking about the work of writing your essays, and how when you're looking at the text, when you're starting to compose these essays, you ask yourself the question, do I believe this? Why do I believe it? Do I not believe this? Why do I not believe this? That move is also a move that these young thinkers are making. And it's really striking because we don't see that kind of question asked in precisely that way. At least I don't before this period. I think it's related to that feeling of like, I must be an authority for myself. I have this interiority, and I have to look inside myself and become kind of consistent. I have to become a sincere person, and I have the right to ask, do I believe this? Why do I believe it? Do I not believe it? Why do I not believe it? So they're asking those very kinds of questions about the tradition that they're involved in different ways. So I'll talk about three of these thinkers. I'm seeing on the Zoom that there are folks in the in the Zoom today who have real specialized expertise in some of these thinkers too. So maybe during the discussion period, they might have some thoughts to share. Let me talk about, let me talk about these three thinkers. So I'm gonna make my way through Shimaji Mokurai, Nakanishi Ushirō, and Kurata Hyakuzō. I'm kind of going from, they're in chronological order, but they're also sort of in wildness order. So I'm going from the most, I would say, respectable to, forgive me, Kurata Hyakuzō, but definitely the least respectable of these thinkers. So Shimaji Mokurai is really essential, I think, for anyone who is in the Nishi Hongwanji world of ideas to know something about. He's so important in terms of what he makes possible even to today. He's often talked about as the man who saved Buddhism, one of the men who saved Buddhism. So he is, he's the son of a Nishi Hongwanji priest. He has the opportunity in 1872 to travel to Europe on a study tour. And in Europe, he is impressed by the notion of religion, which is not a notion that was kind of obvious to Japanese thinkers. It was not obvious that religion was a category, not obvious that Buddhism should count underneath that category. But Shimaji becomes very convinced that indeed Buddhism qualifies as a religion. He comes back to Japan, and he's in a kind of situation in which the Buddhist world is sort of assailed on two sides. On one side, we have Shinto, which is the kind of ritual and intellectual system that was developed and articulated in order to serve the nation. So the idea of Shinto and the idea of Japan as a nation state kind of developing together in a mutually supportive way. If you are to be a Japanese person, you are supposed to also be thinking through a Shinto lens. And then on the other side, Buddhism is kind of assailed by Christianity, which is presenting itself, obviously it's not indigenous to Japan, but as a universal religion, a world religion. So you have the nation, which is identifying with Shinto, and then the world, which is identifying with Christianity. So Shimaji's question is, where and how can I make a space for Buddhism? One of the moves that he makes, which is possible in part because he's very well connected, both within the sect, the wider Buddhist world, and with some people in government, is to push for independence from the state's Great Teaching Campaign. So this might be familiar to some of you already. People had to learn to be Japanese in the 19th and 20th centuries. And part of that process involved the state sponsoring a campaign to teach people the morals and values and practices that get put under the umbrella of Shinto. And for some time, Buddhist priests participated in this campaign for a couple of reasons, because they believed in Japan, and also because it was a way to kind of maintain the relevance of Buddhism as a source of moral thinking. But Shimaji suggested that Buddhist institutions should withdraw. And as a result, Nishi did withdraw. And as a result of that, the campaign ultimately kind of collapsed. That was related to his sense that it was fine for Shinto to be a national morality, but religion was not a matter of national morality, and religion should be kept separate from state interests. So in thinking about Buddhism as a religion, he was also thinking about Buddhism as something separate from the state, meaningfully separate from the state. And then he also participated in an effort to clarify and identify what he called the essentials of Buddhist sects. So he's in a sectarian world, but he believes that there are some points of contact shared across all sectarian forms of Buddhism. And if we can identify those, then we know what the essentials of Buddhism are. And we can see how every sect is a different kind of face or aspect of the same original teaching. So he's very involved in also trying to articulate a non-sectarian Buddhism. It's this non-sectarian, non-state affiliated Buddhism that is what's going to come into focus for him, he thinks, is Buddhism as a religion. So if Buddhism is a religion, it means two things, because religion is both universal and personal. Buddhism is universal because it's transnational, right? It's obviously not limited to Japan. And it's also universal because, unlike Shinto, it's not about who you are as the member of a nation, it's about who you are as a human being. So he says, like Christianity, Buddhism is universal and it's about human beings. Who are you before you're the member of a nation state? Who are you in your deepest self? You're a human being. Huh. If religion is about who you are in your deepest self, well, it's also private because it's about your inner world. So religion should be both universal and private. Shimaji does not have a problem with abandoning the Sumeru cosmology. He says it's fine, Sumeru cosmology, it's not essential to Buddhism, it just comes from Indian mythology. We can let it go, no problem. And then if you follow up with the question, well, if the Sumeru cosmology is just Indian myth, what's the Pure Land? What are the hells? Shimaji also has a very modern kind of answer to that. He says, the Pure Land and the hells are alternate names for states of bliss and suffering. The Pure Land is bliss, and the hells are suffering. And those are states that are subjective within us. We know them. They're private. Because religion is about this inner world of human beings, if you don't have freedom of religion, you can't really develop as a full human being. So freedom of religion is essential to becoming a free person. And that means being self-mastered, right? Acting on your own authority. On top of this, Shimaji envisions Buddhism as asserting the equality of all human beings. So, and again, he goes back to what he understands as the sources of the tradition in India. I'm quoting here my friend Jessica Main's translation of Shimaji writing about the question of human rights. He asks, is it true that no one in Asia has ever proclaimed equal human rights? Because that's the message that's coming from the West. There's no human rights in Asia. You need the West to bring you human rights. Is it true that no one in Asia has ever proclaimed equal human rights? I say not so. Shakyamuni proclaimed them in India long ago. So he's looking at this memory or a tradition that the historical Buddha paid no attention to caste in composing his community. And that for him is proof that right at the foundation of Buddhist tradition is a belief in equal human rights. He also extends that to gender. He makes a somewhat nuanced argument for women and men too as kind of equal partners in creating a world. And he really puts his money where his mouth is in that, in terms of supporting education for girls. So already I think we can see how there's some resonance with contemporary conceptions of what's important in the Shin tradition. I think that notion of equality is also something that people start to think about Shinran as emphasizing, right, in bringing the Buddhist tradition to ordinary farmers, ordinary serfs as followers. And we see it too in the idea of faith as a matter for the inner heart. So if we put Shimaji's two ideas together, we get a picture of faith as about cultivating an inner freedom and then recognizing that everyone has the capacity to do the same. And so cultivating your own inner freedom also means extending that possibility to others. So that's the kind of world that he's envisioning based on religious principles. It's a world of freedom and equality. Piece number 2, Nakanishi Ushirō. He's very interesting. His biography is so interesting. We're moving more radical directions. He's not a priest. He was a journalist, but he was interested in Buddhism. I don't have an image of him. He wrote this book, though. It's kind of early work for essay, serialized essay, I guess. This book is called like a revolution, an argument for revolution in the religious world, or sometimes people say an argument for restoration of religion. This book that's arguing for revolution or reformation attracts the attention of the 21st chief abbot of Nishi Hongwanji. And so although he's not a cleric, Nishi Hongwanji sponsors Nakanishi on a study tour to the United States. And then when he comes back, they offer him a role, again, although he's not a cleric, they offer him a role as an assistant principal at the sect school, which would eventually become Yukoku University. Nakanishi's claim is that there's old Buddhism and new Buddhism. And old Buddhism must either now evolve into new Buddhism or it will vanish. Like Shimaji, he's thinking there's a kind of pressure from the outside, from Christianity, which Nakanishi sees as already having moved from the old to the new. So he's worried the new Christianity must be matched by a new Buddhism, or else the old Buddhism will surely fail. So what is old Buddhism versus new Buddhism? Well, he says two things that I want to emphasize. He says old Buddhism is kind of about theory. So it's like the surface, the skin of the teachings. But new Buddhism is about practice. And by practice, he doesn't mean ritual practice. He means self-investigation. It's about what's going on internally in a person. So old Buddhism is about the skin, the surface, but new Buddhism is about the nerves. We see how he's encountering the notion of a nervous system. If you're practicing internally, if you're practicing at the level of the nerves, then you will feel, he says, the weight of the original vow. The original vow will like impress itself upon you. And he thinks of the original vow as an expression of love, and seems to suggest that we might think of Amida Buddha as that infinite love that is moving us internally. So old Buddhism, because it's about the surface, people will stop at just study. They'll study the texts. But in new Buddhism, people will instead insist on authority based in experience and faith. You can kind of see that where this is likely to go, right? He also says that old Buddhism is a Buddhism for the elites, and new Buddhism is Buddhism for common people. So he has this problem with sectarian scholarship, which is, he sees sectarian scholarship as having just kind of built up an edifice around the text so that ordinary people can't access them. And what scholars should have been doing all along is translating the texts into ordinary Japanese. So sutras in difficult to read Chinese should be translated into plain Japanese. The splendor of Buddhism should light up a humble hut with trails of cooking smoke, rather than a temple with its private black carriage. Out of this, and we can remember, he's not a cleric, but he's embedded in the institution. Out of this, he calls for what sounds like a very dramatic change to the way the institution might be organized. He asks, why have the sect's leaders not yet granted lay Buddhists the right to form a congregation, while our government has already provided its subjects with rights of political participation? So just as people are becoming citizens, he says, if we're going to be citizens, full-fledged citizens, members of the nation, well, we all need to be equal as members of the institution, the religious institution as well. So Shinshu, or Buddhism generally for Nakanishi, is about cultivating a sense of the self as an authority. And on that basis, on the basis that I'm in charge of myself, you can engage others as people who are also in charge of themselves. This is what he thinks the real meaning of self-benefit, benefit others is. It's not about establishing a hierarchical relationship. It's about recognizing everyone in the community as able to speak and think and act for themselves. So third, there are some clear points of contact between Shimaji and Nakanishi, I think. Shimaji is sort of focused more on the, I think, allowing a space for an inner religious world that can then inform a political practice. And Nakanishi is moving more firmly towards thinking of, I think, your religious practice as already kind of organizing a particular structure for the community, political structure for the community. Here's a third one who's very different and interesting. So this is Kurata Hyakuzō. He has a very unusual place in the Shinshu world. He's not a practitioner, and he's very eclectic in the kinds of sources he draws upon. But he's interested in Shinran as a person. He's one of these modern young people who's reading Tanisho. And he writes a play that's published in serialized form about kind of imagined Shinran and his disciples. And that presentation of Shinran in the play is very attractive to a wide audience. And it's part of stimulating a modern turn of the century interest in Shinran. Kurata's Shinran is extremely human in the sense that he's suffering a lot from this kind of complex set of emotional conflicts. And that's very appealing to young readers, like sort of young adult readers. So his play makes this big splash. And then for a number of reasons, he enters a period of deep kind of psychological suffering in his own life. There's a period in which he can't really write anything at all. He goes through a psychological treatment that is clearly drawing very heavily from the Shin repertoire. And he comes out the other side and starts writing again about his experience of going through this nervous breakdown. And he goes back to writing about Shinran in that period too. He sees Shinran as having also gone through a nervous breakdown. And he understands Shinran Shinjin as a recovery from or breaking through the wall of nervous breakdown. So Kurata is criticized a lot by scholars in this sect who say, oh, you don't actually know very much about Shinran and you've misinterpreted most of what you've read. And Kurata says, oh yes, I know. It's fine. The Shinran I write about is the Shinran from my own heart. And no one can tell me that the Shinran in my own heart is not the true Shinran, because of course it's the true Shinran. I met him in my heart. So this is a case of a very clear encounter between one way of thinking about what knowledge is and a really different way of thinking about what knowledge is. But Kurata's way of thinking about what knowledge is has some appeal to folks. He thinks of Amida as the life force. Amida is the life force that's causing everything in the world to come to life. And freedom, faith, is connecting with that life force and recognizing that that life force is saying, whatever you want to do, you should do it. You're free to do it. So these are two really different possibilities. We have vision coming from within the institution of freedom as self-mastery, right? Being your own authority and recognizing others as their own authority and trying on that basis to form a community. And then we have Kurata saying, I don't need a community. I'm a pure individual and I do whatever I like. But on both sides, they're thinking, what is Buddhism really about? It's really about becoming a full human being. And on both sides, they're thinking, what is important to us in the tradition is that Shinran was a full human being. Unlike many of those around him, we can look back to Shinran and kind of see, oh, in Japanese history, the first human being, and we can access the same kind of freedom and interiority. Thank you all. This is very kind of preliminary, so I'd love to hear from folks.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Actually have you here. So many fascinating details and facts here that I'm scrambling to try to find a question because there's so many interesting topics here. But in the chat box, questions, and one of those questions I'd like to ask you, if I can just go ahead and read this. It says, what degree does this kind of intense imperialism, whether that's Western imperialism or Japanese imperialism, impact the thinking of this time, whether it's imperialism or
Yeah, sure. Let me just take a look at the question and try to make sure that I understand it well. To what degree does this time of intense imperialism impact thinking of this time, whether imperialistic or anti-imperialistic? That's a really wonderful question. I think it's complicated, right? Because it's a long period. If we start with Shimaji and go all the way to Kurata, so it does not seem to me as though that's a kind of unbroken period of intense imperialism. Although, of course, imperialism makes sense to think of as a through line. Off the top of my head, not having thought deeply enough to really do justice to the question, I think, one of the things that I see in all three of these thinkers is an important possibility that has not yet been resolved, which is the question of the relationship between universalism or cosmopolitanism and imperialism. So there's one kind of thread I think we can lift out here that is about going beyond the boundaries of the nation state and perhaps even thinking of yourself in tension or contradiction to the nation state as a human being in the world like other human beings. And that's a kind of foundation for a cosmopolitan thinking about human rights, about a kind of global community, about shared concern. So it doesn't sound very imperialist, right? But that gets attached to some efforts to bring Japan to the rest of the world, or on the other side, right? To bring the United States, for example, into Japan, that clearly we would identify now as a imperialist endeavor. So we look at someone like Shimaji, we kind of see a moment in which, or Nakanishi maybe too, we see a moment in which there's a hope for a cosmopolitanism. And then by the time we get to Kurata, we really see like, oh yeah, this has curdled into imperialism. Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think it's in the background all the time.
Thank you very much for joining back up with us. I think everybody's here joined back up here at this room too as well. And we'd like to continue on with Professor Profett's presentation, Rethinking Pure Land Buddhism.
Thank you again for the introduction, and thank you to BCA, IBS, Jodo Shinshu International Office, and everyone for your hard work in bringing this event together. It's really an honor to be here. I think the last time I was here was maybe 10 years ago for a grad student conference. I was lucky enough to meet Professor Richard Payne and Scott Mitchell and a few other people who have been great allies and huge help in kind of navigating all the busyness of the last 10 years. So it's really wonderful to be here again. By way of an introduction, what I'll be presenting on in session 1 is some excerpts from my book that will be coming out called Esoteric Pure Land Buddhism through the University of Hawaii's Pure Land Buddhist Studies series. And then in session 2, it'll be the last chapter of that book, smoothed out sections of that session. And, in thinking about Pure Land Buddhism, or perhaps rethinking Pure Land Buddhism, I've been thinking about one of the issues in my field, which is the reluctance some scholars have in thinking deeply about Pure Land Buddhism. To give you an example, but from my own life, when I was very young, I got interested in Buddhism, started reading all these books, went to college, majored in religion, continued studying Buddhism, and then moved to Japan to be an English teacher and to see if I liked living abroad and get better at Japanese. And my students were Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. My neighbors were Jodo Shinshu Buddhists. The owner of the sushi restaurant below my apartment, who became my best good buddy, he was a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist. And I had this important question: what's Jodo Shinshu? But more importantly, how could I have missed this? How could I have spent 10 years diligently reading books about Buddhism in English, learning Japanese, and how come I don't know about the largest school of Buddhism in Japan? How could I have been studying and practicing Buddhism for this long and not know about what might be, Pure Land Buddhism, the largest form of Buddhism in the world? How do you miss something like that, right? Now, I have met people, whether they're scholars or practitioners, who come to this realization and they say, oh, well, what I've been doing was right all along, and those people must be confused. And I think that's why many people ignore Pure Land, because it doesn't seem to fit into what you think you know about Buddhism. I had a different reaction, and I've had this experience many times in my life. Whoa, I know nothing. What a wonderful opportunity to learn more, right? I feel like grad school is just a continuous revolving door of that. Like, whoa, I thought I knew a thing and I do not. And now I get to learn more about it, right? But the great thing about Buddhist studies is you get to have that experience in multiple languages at the same time, which is exhausting. Okay, so I've been trying to think through this problem, rethinking Pure Land Buddhism. And in this session, I'll be going through some of the things that I've been working on and trying to think through and some things that I've been learning along the way. By the 1st century CE, some 500 years after the death of Shakyamuni Buddha, a diverse range of texts and traditions began to flow into East Asia. As Buddhists in East Asia worked to account for the diversity of the Buddhisms they were encountering, a variety of specialties and areas of study proliferated, each focusing on a particular set of texts, practices, and so on. This seems to have given rise to a Catholic universal engagement with Buddhist diversity, and East Asian Buddhist culture developed into a competitive yet interconnected environment as lineages associated with major temple complexes endeavored to procure patronage and influence through the mastery of multiple areas of study. For example, a member of the Chan lineage, or its offshoots of Korean Son or Japanese Zen, was not restricted to the practice of a particular form of meditation. Rather, in addition to participating in the mythic lineage of the Buddha mind school, here we have Bodhidharma looking I feel conveniently confused as we talk about this diversity. A practitioner was empowered to perhaps help beings attain rebirth in Sukhavati, the land of bliss, master mystical incantations called dadani or even mantra, receive initiation into an esoteric Buddhist ritual lineage, or focus on the study of the Lotus Sutra in accordance with the doctrinal and meditative systems associated with the Tiantai lineage, or the Avatamsaka Sutra in accordance with the Huayan lineage's system of exegesis, and so on. Basically, everything overlapped with everything somewhere. Before the 17th century, Japanese Buddhism was for the most part in step with its diverse, cosmopolitan, and fluid pan-East Asian Mahayana Buddhist culture. Japanese monks often specialized in multiple disciplines or areas of study simultaneously. However, with the establishment of the Tokugawa regime, an important paradigm shift occurred in Japan. Still fresh in people's mind were the disruptions and upheaval of the Warring States period, where temples often functioned as armed fortresses. In the interest of peace, the government instituted a general prohibition against inter- and intra-sectarian rivalry and competition. By government decree, officially recognized sectarian institutions were created, and all Japanese Buddhist temples were required to be affiliated with a particular head temple. These head temples were tasked with the establishment of set sectarian orthodoxies, identities, lineages, and so on, effectively bringing an end to the dynamic and fluid, and at times violent and contentious, competition between rival factions, lineages, and sublineages within and between different institutions. The education of monks came to focus on the teachings of sect founders and the official representatives of these newly established orthodox positions. Ritual training was aimed at preserving and passing down the ritual lineages associated with newly created sectarian institutions. The emergence of sectarian studies and the exclusive study of a single body of doctrinal literature that resulted led to the early modern compartmentalization of Japanese Buddhist cultural knowledge. But this is just one part of the story. The tendency to study Buddhism as if it were comprised of discrete schools or kinds or phylogenetic species of Buddhism emerged from the complex machinations rooted in the blending of Japanese sectarian studies with Western academic approaches to Buddhism. In the late 19th, early 20th centuries, when Western-style universities were first established in Japan, traditional Buddhist seminaries were recast as modern universities that combine Tokugawa-area sectarian institutional models with the European university model. Meanwhile, for some time, European scholars, missionaries, and colonial administrative officials had slowly begun to piece together that the various forms of idolatry in Siam, China, and Japan were modern-day descendants or species of an ancient Indian religion soon to be called Buddhism. The foundation of the discipline we now know as Buddhist studies was in some sense established by the French philologist and Orientalist Eugène Burnouf. Don Lopez notes that Burnouf's foray into the textual world of Buddhism began in 1827 when Brian Hodgson sent a cache of Sanskrit manuscripts to Europe. Burnouf's research into this box of texts, which he published in 1844 in the Introduction to the History of Buddhism in India. I will not attempt the French pronunciation. It'll sound like a mix of Spanish and Japanese. So, this was the first Western language monograph on the history of Indian Buddhism. The sense at the time was that we will benevolently give the Buddhists their history. According to Lopez, quote, "We must acknowledge with the utmost respect the remarkable achievements of Eugène Burnouf. However, that feeling of respect carries with it a certain sense of disquiet, that something has gone wrong. We might then regard 1844 as the year when everything changed, dividing time as the Christians do into two periods, before and after a fateful year. In this case, the period after the epoch-making date is not simply a period of redemption, but also a period of loss." Burnouf worked tirelessly to uncover what he believed to be the earliest layers of the Buddhist teachings, attempting to extract from the, quote, "mass of words so empty," by that meaning Mahayana Sutras and the Tantras, the simple moral teachings of the human Buddha, a figure that in some sense was crafted in Burnouf's own image. Lopez has referred to this Buddha as Burnouf's Buddha. I often refer to it as Barnes and Noble Buddha. because this Buddha is alive and well in popular and academic writing. The Buddha Burnouf discovered in his box of books appeared to mirror the rational sciences of modern Europe and the philosophy of the Greeks, and shared Burnouf's disdain for ritualism and metaphysics. Burnouf made little effort to hide his contempt for the so-called developed sutras and tantras now associated with Mahayana Buddhism, and this way of thinking about Buddhist literature greatly influenced and was adapted by generations of Buddhist studies scholars who did not recognize Mahayana Buddhism or Buddhism outside of India as authentic. The term Chinese Buddhism, quote unquote, was first used by a missionary who intended it as a term of derision. Burnouf's version of the Buddha, a figure, quote from Lopez, born from the brow of a European scholar who never set foot in Asia, was quickly employed by Orientalist scholars as a standard against which contemporary living Buddhist cultures were found lacking. Following Burnouf, many scholars of Buddhism regarded the texts we now identify as the Pali Canon, the so-called simple suttas, as constituting the original teachings of the Buddha himself. And they saw the developed Mahayana sutras as spurious later additions. However, recent scholarship in Pali and Theravada Buddhist studies has significantly undermined this foundational assumption, and scholars of early Mahayana, quote unquote, have investigated the many areas of overlap between the so-called simple and developed textual lineages. Interestingly enough, scholars of early Mahayana question whether or not the term early Mahayana is even coherent. Early in relation to what? Do we really know? It is possible that the Pali Canon was compiled around the beginning of the 1st century BCE. However, the Pali Canon to which we have access was edited in the 5th century CE. Furthermore, though indeed the Pali Suttas at a glance appear to be simpler than the often extremely ornate and lengthy Mahayana sutras, scholars such as Burnouf and others had to read very selectively to extrapolate a rational human Buddha from the Pali Canon. Many Pali specialists are now critical of the notion that the Pali Canon and Theravada Buddhism somehow represent a pristine early Buddhism. Theravada today is a modern tradition, just like every other Buddhist tradition. Because early scholars of Buddhism assumed that Mahayana was necessarily a later addition, they tended to look at the features of Mahayana literature that differentiated from the simple suttas, such as the Bodhisattva path, Buddhakshetra, and celestial Buddhas, and certain genres of philosophical and ritual literature, and seek to find out explanations for the origins of those elements. Recent scholarship has, however, significantly complicated this quest for origins approach and forces us to reconceive what we might mean by the term Mahayana Buddhism. For example, Jan Nattier has demonstrated that the Bodhisattva path was one of many early mainstream Buddhist vocations. Practitioners of the Bodhisattva path memorized sutras that promoted the Bodhisattva path while simultaneously participating in mainstream Buddhist monastic culture. Bodhisattvas were not members of a different kind of Buddhism. Rather, they were practitioners who pursued an approved, though perhaps distinct vocation within the broader context of mainstream early Buddhism. Gregory Chopin notes that, quote, the history of Mahayana literature and the history of the religious movement that bears its name are not necessarily the same thing. In other words, we have evidence, end quote. In other words, we have evidence for sutras that we now label as Mahayana long before Mahayana Buddhism as such emerged as a sociologically distinct tradition. Archaeological evidence suggests that Mahayana Buddhism did not emerge as a separate and distinct tradition until perhaps the 6th century, but there is textual evidence suggesting that some layers of Mahayana literature were in a relatively developed form by the 1st century BCE. The intellectual currents we now label Mahayana, therefore, evolved gradually over a long period of development across various traditions and locations, stretching back to the prehistorical Buddhist tradition. Gregory Chopin has critically examined an inscription found in Mathura, dating perhaps to the 2nd or 3rd century, that some scholars suggest is the earliest mention of the Buddha Amitabha, a quote-unquote Mahayana Buddha in a quote-unquote non-Mahayana context. Luis Gomez has noted a high degree of continuity between the Sutta Nipata, a non-Mahayana textual collection, and the philosophical traditions associated with Madhyamaka and Prajnaparamita. In particular, he argues that Madhyamaka and Prajnaparamita literature may have represented a conservative rejection of what were perceived as innovations in Abhidharma. In other words, how to differentiate Mahayana from non-Mahayana Buddhism in the earliest layers of Buddhist literature to which we have access is not always clear-cut. The key problem for Burnouf in 1844 and other scholars for the subsequent 100 years was how to make sense of the radical diversity of Buddhist texts without any knowledge of the historical context of their development. We could in some sense compare this to if you knew nothing of European history and tried to compare a Baptist sermon to a tract by Augustine. This one looks simple, so it must be early, and this one looks complicated, so it must be later, right? As more of the contextual framework has come to light, the seemingly clear division between Mahayana and non-Mahayana traditions has become blurred. According to Paul Moose, the currents whence, love that word, whence, the currents whence the Mahayana derived seem to have influenced from the start the whole of the church. The tradition began by developing entirely in one direction, and it is only later that a quote-unquote Hinayanist Buddhism detached itself from the common movement, leaving the Mahayana to continue and accentuate the latter. Furthermore, Jonathan Silk writes, literature commonly cited in discussions of Mahayana Buddhism as that of sectarian Buddhism, and surely not rarely implied to represent some pre-Mahayana ideas, in fact, date from a period after the rise of the Mahayana Buddhist movement. The materials to which we are comparing our extant Mahayana literature may well have been written or revised in light of that very Mahayana Buddhist material itself, and vice versa ad infinitum. We redefine ourselves in relation to those we perceive to be opponents or different. In other words, ideas, teachings, and practices we have come to regard as inherently Mahayana in orientation may have already been present within a heterogeneous early Buddhist environment. As Mahayana Buddhists came to differentiate themselves from others, some communities that identified as Mahayana formed, while other communities identified as non-Mahayana. We're not like those guys. Okay. Gradual schisms led to different groups to define and redefine their texts and teachings against which they perceived as opponents or heretics. In order to excavate a pure Buddhism, more in line with the modernist religious and philosophical points of view, early European Orientalist scholars of Buddhism relied on essentialist modes of defining Mahayana, divorcing it from its development within mainstream Buddhism. Mahayana soteriologies, as well as the tantric ritual texts so scandalous to Victorian readers, were the first to go. It is not simply the case that Western scholars were creating a narrow view of Buddhism, but also Asian intellectuals responded to, adapted, appropriated, and in turn influenced Western scholarship as well. Japanese Buddhist thinkers, reacting to this dominant international academic milieu, set about clarifying the finer points of their particular lineages and formulated new ways to present their traditions on an international stage. In order to counter the critique, the Mahayana Buddhism in general and East Asian Buddhism in particular was inauthentically Buddhist. In 1879, Kasahara Kinju and Nanjo Bunyu, both priests of Jodo Shinshu School of Japanese Pure Land Buddhism, arrived in England to study Sanskrit under the famous Orientalist Max Muller. Like many European Buddhologists, Muller did not regard Mahayana Buddhism, or especially Pure Land Buddhism, as authentic, and condescendingly hoped that by training his Asian students, he would in turn help their countrymen to return to the original true teachings of the Buddha. When Japanese scholars first studied Sanskrit, Pali, and Buddhist studies in Europe, encountered the idea that Mahayana Buddhism was not the teaching of the Buddha, it became imperative for them to determine how to adapt this new European Buddhist studies framework. Some Pure Land Buddhists and Western interpreters alike define Shin Buddhism as a religion of pure faith established by a great founder akin to Martin Luther. As these apologia emerge in response to the Orientalist criticism of Mahayana Buddhism, they ultimately accommodated and supported that framework established by the Orientalists. Just as essentialist readings of the origins of many elements of Mahayana Buddhism may be called into question by recent research, so too can we critically examine how these traditions were redefined in the modern period to fit with the parameters of the Oriental study of Buddhism. Scholars of Mahayana Buddhism and the Pali Canon have come to evaluate how these heuristic constructs may be reconceived in light of recent research. Scholars of Pure Land Buddhism must also reevaluate how modernist agendas in Europe and Japan led to the creation of overly reified objects of inquiry that are divorced from the complex networks of overlap and interaction within which these objects of inquiry actually function. While scholars have commonly defined Pure Land Buddhism as a kind or species of Buddhism peculiar to the East Asian cultural sphere, rebirth in Sukhavati is a pervasive aspect of Mahayana soteriological path to Buddhahood. Because modern Japanese Pure Land scholar priests made significant connections with the early European Buddhist studies environment, most scholarship and popular writing on Mahayana culture tends to rely on the modern Japanese Pure Land school's own self-presentation as the default perspective on Pure Land Buddhism. This streamlined version of the history of Pure Land Buddhism often simplifies the diverse forms of Mahayana practice and teachings related to Buddha Kshetra, or Pure Land, to fit this particular template, in which case the teachings of Honen and Shinran serve as the principal point of reference, or even the natural evolutionary goal, the fulfillment of Mahayana. Early Western scholars were highly dismissive of Pure Land Buddhism in general, and Shin Buddhism in particular. They saw it as a deviant, otherworldly East Asian tradition, whereas they believed true Buddhism was early and Indian, of course, as revealed by the benevolent Western colonizers. Gale and Amstutz, more recently, Wendy Dossett, have examined the role that Orientalism has played in the dismissal of Shin Buddhism in Western scholarship, not just on Buddhism, but Japan as well. Though Shin Buddhism in particular and Pure Land Buddhism in general has generally been a less popular area of research outside Japan, Shin Buddhists were some of the first to successfully adapt their approach to Buddhism to this modernist framework. As a result, when European and American Buddhologists mention Pure Land, they often reference the Shin point of view, seemingly assuming it to be universal. In some cases, scholars even uncritically exactly replicate sectarian historiography as if it were a comprehensive historical account of the development of Pure Land thought and practice. At that time, however, Shin Buddhists could only go so far, it seems, as it's likely impossible to fully break down the Orientalist framework in the late 19th and early 20th century. In defending Shin Buddhism as the standard against which to evaluate the place of Buddha Kshetra in Mahayana literature, the diverse ways that Buddha Kshetra may have functioned in Mahayana Buddhism and beyond has been somewhat downgraded from a ubiquitous dimension of Mahayana Buddhism to the exclusive property of one sect of Japanese Buddhism. Fujita Kotatsu notes that references to Amitabha Buddha may be found in over 1/3 of the text of the Chinese canon, and Jataka tales recounting the past lives of Amitabha are found in many Mahayana sutras. Moreover, aspiration for rebirth in Sukhavati has been a common goal for some early Buddhists. Chopin notes that the goal of rebirth in Sukhavati is found throughout Mahayana Sutra and Tantra literature, and is likely fully established as one of the common tropes of this literature, at least by the 2nd century. Chopin notes that evidence drawn from the 3rd century Samadhi Raja Sutra, the 2nd century Ashtasahasrika Prajnaparamita Sutra, and many other sutras suggest that rebirth in Sukhavati had already emerged as a generalized soteriological goal in the environment within which Mahayana sutras were first written down. Moreover, some early versions of the Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra, as well as the Akshobhya Vyuha Sutra and the Ajita Sena Mahayana Sutra, include arhats among the beings reborn in Sukhavati. This suggests that when it comes to Sukhavati aspiration, there may have been no clear line between Mahayana and non-Mahayana. References to the Buddha Kshetra of the 10 directions is a prevalent feature of the Mahayana textual world that remains to some extent under-theorized. Since the early 20th century, scholars working on Pure Land Buddhism have observed this, including Teresina Rowell in her 1933 Yale PhD dissertation, which was published as a series of articles in the Eastern Buddhist Journal. Rowell notes, in view of the, quote, in view of the great importance of the concept for this understanding of Mahayana literature, it is strange how universally the Buddha Kshetra or Pure Land has been neglected by writers on the Mahayana. You could say the same thing today, and this was written in 1933. She also argues that sustained study of the Buddha Kshetra concept across Mahayana and non-Mahayana literature illustrates far-reaching ethical and philosophical implications. More recently, Giorgio Halkias has also noted the that, quote, the obscure origins of the Buddha fields and their insignificant presence in Shravakayana Buddhism have led a number of scholars and proponents of European construction of a pure original Buddhism to adapt a condescending and dismissive attitude toward the soteriology of Pure Lands, which is often disparaged as the wishful thinking of simpletons grasping for a better life in heavenly realms after death. Rupert Gethin has noted, and Rupert Gethin is one of the top scholars of Theravada Buddhism, has noted a general disinterest in the study of cosmology more broadly in Buddhist studies scholarship. Quote, the overall paucity of scholarly materials dealing with Buddhist cosmology would seem to reflect a reluctance on the part of modern scholarship to treat this dimension of Buddhist thought as having any serious bearing on those fundamental Buddhist teachings with which we are so familiar. Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, No Self, Dependent Arising, and so on. The effect of this is to divorce the bare doctrinal formations of Buddhist thought from a traditional mythic context, unquote. Calling for a renewed interest in Buddha Kshetra, Randy Clotesley argues that doctrine and cosmology are inherently intertwined, since cosmology can be taken as the concretization of doctrinal concepts. Let's think about the origin of the Buddha Kshetra idea. Because Buddha Kshetra were, according to the early Orientalists, at odds with the original teachings of the historical Buddha, again, something to which scholars really don't have a lot of historical access, scholars have tried to figure out where this concept came from. Explanations for the origin of the Buddha Kshetra concept have generally fallen into two categories. First, some scholars look to non-Buddhist sources in the traditions of Greece, Persia, Iran, Christianity, or as well as Hindu Bhakti thought. Second, early scholars believe the Pali Canon represented the earliest layers of Buddhist literature, and many look to it for precursors to the Buddha Kshetra concept, often seeking cognate concepts to those emphasized in the modern Pure Land schools. However, when we forget about Burnouf's Buddha, the Buddha created by and for white European imperialists, acknowledge that both the non-Mahayana and Mahayana literature to which we have access actually emerged from a more complex and dynamic shared environment of myths and symbols, and read these traditions together and against the grain of received knowledge, the need to assign foreign origins to these concepts simply vanishes. During the Kushana dynasty, Northern Indian culture had contact with Near Eastern, Greek, and Central Asian cultures. So scholars looking beyond India for the genesis of Sukhavati investigated potential ties to Eden and Elysian and Zoroastrian paradises. The Buddha Amitabha was said to be an adaptation of the Zoroastrian god of light, Ahura Mazda. They sound similar, I can see why you'd say that. But Fujita Kotatsu notes that such simplistic theories of influence, however, fail to take into account the generic nature of afterlife imagery and the ubiquity of light deities across cultures and the fluidity of these cultural boundaries. In response to the argument that the Buddha Kshetra concept originated outside of India, Gomez, Halkias, and Fujita assert that there's really no need to look beyond India. Indigenous South Asian religious culture provided just as much, if not more, material upon which early Buddhists could draw. Some scholars have argued the Buddha Kshetra teaching came from non-Buddhist Indian religious influence. Fujita has examined many different arguments that propose origin in diverse Hindu traditions. For example, the word Amrita, which means ambrosia, and people have argued is the root for the name Amitabha and Amitayus, was synonymous with the mythic psychotropic substance soma, which is said to bring enlightenment to those who drink it. In this case, Amrita is soma, which also carries the connotation of light and is thus connected with solar deities. Others have looked to Krishna Bhakti devotion in references to deathbed practices in the Bhagavad Gita. Call upon my name and I will come to you on your deathbed. Right? However, it is well known that Bhakti-like forms of devotion were pan-Indian, not exclusive to Krishna worship, so influence is hard to prove here as well. The motif of being born from a lotus blossom described in the Sukhavi Vyuha Sutra is well attested across South Asian religious traditions. Gods such as Brahma and Lakshmi are described as emerging from lotuses along with other beings born in the heaven of the 33. In all of these cases, the different elements of the Sukhavati mythos, devotion, and literary imagery found in descriptions of Buddha Kshetra can be seen not necessarily as influences from outside Buddhism, but rather signs that mark Buddhist authors and thinkers as participants in a broader South Asian cultural environment. Buddhism is Indian, after all. According to Fujita, the most sensible approach is to regard Amida as the necessary consequence of the evolving concept of Buddhahood. Many scholars now recognize, as Halkias notes, that, quote, the cult of Amitabha and his Pure Land can be adequately explained doctrinally as an endemic evolution of Indian Buddhism, not as something that came from elsewhere. The concept of Buddhas purifying their spheres of influence or abiding in divine realms appears to be a common theme across textual traditions, Mahayana and otherwise. The Katavatu, a Theravadan text, reveals that some Mahasangika Buddhists believe that, quote, Buddhas pervade all directions of the universe. The Mahavastu of the Lokotaravadins also discusses the existence of multiple Buddhas and mentions some worlds don't even have Buddhas, as Buddhas are rare indeed. John Strong's examination of Abhidhamma literature, collections of past life tales, reveals that preparations made for the arrival of the Buddha closely mirror descriptions found in Mahayana sutras of the array of the Buddha Kshetra and mandalas, which, by the way, are technically pure lands. A Buddha sphere of influence is their pure land, a mandala, there's overlap. Barao's analysis of Buddha Abhidhamma reveals a non-Mahayana text that contains ways of thinking about Buddha Kheta, that's the Pali term for Buddha Kshetra, as a Buddhist sphere of influence that are quite similar to what we now see as Buddha Kshetra, the Pure Land. He notes that there are references to numerous Buddhas throughout the 10 directions, quote, as many as there are numerous jewels both in heaven above and earth below. This Buddhist multiverse is described in ways reminiscent of a mandala-like palace. Kenneth Norman's examination of the Buddha Abhidhamma builds upon Barao, who notes that, quote, the Buddha himself tells of the Buddha Khetas, ideal lands of beauty where the Buddhas live. A picture is painted of Buddhas questioning one another, and there is mention of disciples questioning the Buddhas and vice versa. Norman notes that some scholars have dismissed this evidence, which seems to point to a more complex relationship between Mahayana and non-Mahayana Buddhist conceptions of cosmology and Buddhology as mere Mahayana influence, an accretion. However, he contends that, quote, many ideas in Buddhism follow from dynamics of early Buddhist thought, which led to the existence of one and the same idea in two forms in two different traditions. In other words, Buddhas of the present abiding in worlds accessible to us may have been a feature of the early Buddhist environment that is not necessarily a later Mahayana concept. Christian Wedemeyer notes that the exclusive focus on Shakyamuni, closely associated with non-Mahayana literature today, may have emerged as a reaction against Buddhist traditions that had a more diverse Buddhology, suggesting that, historically speaking, focusing on one Buddha may be a minority position in the broader history of Buddhism. Quote, all the Buddhist communities of which we know allowed for the existence of a number of Buddhas other than Gautama. In fact, in the view of many early Buddhist schools, with the notable exception of the Mahaviharavasan branch that came to dominate later Theravada, Buddhas were considered, quote, infinite in both space and time, a view that became normative for the later Mahayana movement. However, even among contemporary Theravada communities, who only admit to one Buddha of the present, the following verse appears in widely recited liturgies, quote, the Buddhas of the past and those yet to come, those of the present too, to these, plural, I pay homage always, end quote. All of which suggests that throughout the course of history, by far the majority of Buddhist communities considered themselves to inhabit a world overflowing with Buddhas. Multiple Buddhas, not only of the past and future, but for some also of the present. Why not? Instead of viewing Pure Land Buddhism as distinct from Mahayana Buddhism, or even Mahayana Buddhism as clearly differentiated from early Buddhism, by looking to and reading across specific textual and cultural contexts, we may productively reconsider how the diversity of the early Buddhist environment gave rise to multiple, potentially overlapping visions of the Buddhist universe. Reading across genres, scholars have productively critiqued the often very narrow perspective from which Pure Land Buddhism has been approached as merely a kind of Mahayana Buddhism or East Asian Buddhism. We discovered that concepts related to Buddha Kshetra have been fundamental to how Buddhists in many traditions have articulated their understanding of the Buddhist universe, transcending even the purported division between Mahayana and non-Mahayana. These insights help broaden our understanding both of the early prehistorical context for the development of Buddhism and the later Mahayana expressions of Sukhavati aspiration and Amitabha devotion. Thank you.
Very much, Sensei. Are there any kind of comments? I don't really see any in the chat box here. Please feel free to kind of jump in if you have any comments that you would like to have Professor Profett kind of address. While they kind of think about that, some of the things that, one of the things that popped into my mind is you cited Frista Sensei, stating that it was a necessary consequence of Buddhahood, that Amida was this necessary consequence of Buddhahood. And it kind of reminded me of this idea of in Shinshu doctrine that they say the Jisoshin and Imotoshin, which is that that Amida Buddha emerges precisely because there are sentient beings who are caught in pain and affliction and needed Amida or needs Amida to save them. So Amida and vice versa, Amida Buddha needs the sentient being to save. The object of Amida's salvific activity is the sentient being. So as long as there's sentient beings for con-delusion, there is the necessity of Amida Buddha. So that's the Jisoshin, Imotoshin idea. And so that kind of just popped into my mind as I was thinking about how you're explaining that Buddhahood or Amida Buddha came about as kind of this end result of different cultures and lines of thinking that were thinking about this issue of what Buddhahood actually means. Thank you.
One thing that reminds me of is, when we think about the spread of Buddhism throughout India, South Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, there was a lot of intentional strategic adaptation, right? One of the things that scholars often point to is Buddhist monks were willing to deal with death and death pollution. Not just these are bodies and they'll decompose, but also what about the potentially vengeful spirits, right? So Buddhist monks would come in, they'd cremate the body, and they would send the spirit on to the Pure Land or to a better rebirth or something like that, right? So, thinking about that and thinking about the way that Buddhism has adapted over time, I've come to think of some of these early, pioneering entrepreneurial priests as early scholars of religion, right? They're thinking about what does the target audience need? What do they expect? Like you think about like the expanding cosmology. It's like, oh, you have gods and ghosts and spirits stuff. Cool. They fit here, here, and here around Mount Sumeru in these particular ranges. You have these gods. Cool. Let's bring the gods in too, right? One of the most interesting things I find in going to temples in Japan is you've got gods from India and China and Korea and Japan all hanging out together in the same space, right? So I think it's like I had like a religious vacuum cleaner, just like sucks it all up, and then he gets to Japan, just kind of open the bag. It's like everybody's together hanging out. Like it's so interesting. But then I'm thinking about like this tendency within Buddhism to try to adapt the Dharma to particular contexts and particular needs of people, right? Shakyamuni Buddha, from what we can tell from some traditions, had an anti-substantialist, anti-foundationalist perspective. We see this with Nagarjuna and various other traditions as well. And yet there is this desire from people to have that, right? When the Buddha identifies the middle path, we have the extreme of nihilism and the extreme of eternalism. It's not just to deny those, but to recognize these are human tendencies to want this sort of thing. So it's rather, here are two things we have to deal with in people to kind of bring them to this other way of thinking. And I think seeking an afterlife or seeking contact with the Buddha after Shakyamuni has passed, that those are kind of natural reactions that people had that then the Buddhists are, and I always think of it as like a kind of spiritual judo, like someone comes in, if you look at like, Shakyamuni's debates with people, here's my assertion. Okay, let's take this assertion and move it this way and have a different conversation. It's been noted, he doesn't say no, he says yes and, like a good improv artist, right? So I think that if we can kind of, rather than compartmentalizing this kind of business, is to look at that kind of dialogic production and engagement with tradition that Buddhist monks have been doing for forever, right? So.
Yeah, thank you very much. That kind of ties in with Curley, since it's talking about imagine the pre-modern era and maybe the needs of the time when I think about Renya Shonin, and he says Gosho no Ichidaichi, that thinking about that the most important matter is what happens when we pass, and so that was the need at the time that we could think of and argue. Yeah. Thank you very much. So I'm going to read some of these comments here. Victoria says, placing Pure Land in context, showing up the Orientalist warping of our vision of Pure Land. This is something I definitely want to focus on later on today. I found myself getting madder and madder. I was reading your citations. Thank you very much. And then Jessica Main writes, thank you for this talk and for getting at the historical complexity of some of the things that tend to be taken for granted, how the Mahayana formed, how Amida Buddha might have coalesced. So she's grateful for your thoughts and insight here. Okay, thank you very much. And I think that's a kind of a good note. Are there any other kind of comments from the audience, perhaps? Maybe I could take.
I have one quick,
Yes,
one
yes,
quick
yes,
comment.
please jump in.
Yeah, like I get fired up about this stuff, right? And when you hear this phrase like, what is it that radicalized them? Like, I hope this is a thing that radicalizes people. Like this is an interesting, compelling problem that's been evolving over time, right? So yeah, hopefully, that one professor said that thing, and I want to learn more about that problem, right? Yeah.
Let's see. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that comment. I think this is kind of building a little bit on Jessica's comment. You have attributed a beautiful transition to the volume of Pure Land, Asian Pure Land text and context.
Pure Lands in Asian text and context, I think.
So one of the goals of that volume, I guess, is to do some of what you described, thinking about pure lands beyond the framework of Shinshu. But you're also obviously very deeply interested in Shinshu and Shinran thought. So I was hoping you would tell us a little bit about what do you think, as someone who's both familiar with the kind of broader sweep of Mahayana treatments of pure lands, reading Shinran, what stands out for you in Shinran that you might find otherwise go unnoticed?
Oh dear. There's a.
Okay, I hope I can articulate what she just said. So she mentioned that in thinking about Pure Land beyond the framework of Shinshu, but Profett Sensei is also kind of really interested in Shin Buddhism. And so in this discussion of this broader sweep of Mahayana Buddhism, what stands out in terms of Shinran's thought in thinking about this in his presentation just now. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, like what do you think what do you see in Shinran that would otherwise not be?
Sure.
What do you see in Shinran that we would otherwise not see?
This is something I'm going to get into a little more detail in the second session, but briefly, when I was first kind of conceiving my project, like on the one hand, I struggled finding people who wanted to just read Shinran with me, the outside of people's area of interest or whatever. And so I was like, okay, I can work on something else. But then in dialoguing with Shin scholars in the US and Japan, first problem I encountered is like, wow, there's so much Shin scholarship in Japanese, and my Japanese was not that good at the time. It's passable now, but it's like, I can't read all this. And even if I did, what can I say that would be original? There's so much, right? The other problem that I've encountered, I've heard this said by scholars in Japan and the United States, is that some Shin Buddhists get stuck in an echo chamber. There are so many Shin Buddhists in Japan, you can just only talk to Shin Buddhists and not have to worry about talking to anybody else, right? That's not the situation in the US, but that's still a dynamic to the tradition, right? There's insider lingo, inside baseball, and someone trying to get in on that, can be a challenge, right? And so I began thinking like, okay, like what if we think about some of these ideas in dialogue, in these broader contexts, right? On the one hand, give me the opportunity to say something original by picking something obscure to work on, but also in connecting it to everything else, right? So right now, I've been involved with a Jodo Shinshu reading group, just me and a few people, mostly Shin priests at this point, kind of getting together, chatting about the Jodo Shinshu. Sometimes we talk about other stuff, but usually we read the text and we have a conversation. It's a whole thing. But what I've been really thinking through is, Shinran wasn't talking to Shin Buddhists. Shinran was talking to Shingon Buddhists and Tendai Buddhists and people from various doctrinal perspectives. So what is it that he was presenting that got their attention? Because clearly it did, right? But if we read Shinran the way that we often do, we're reading it from the perspective of a Shin Buddhist, of a text that's talking to Shin Buddhist interests, but there's another way of thinking about that text. So that's something that I've been kind of working through in my mind right now, and then looking at some of the scholarship of people who have been asking similar questions of, how do we think of Shinran as embedded in this esoteric context, with Tendai philosophy being one of the dominant traditions, on Huayan philosophy and everything else, and there's some interesting points of contact, right? One of the things that I've been thinking about is, number one, why doesn't Shinran quote the Lotus Sutra? But he talks about the one vehicle all the time. What I've gleaned from some Japanese scholars, Asada Sensei Ryukoku, for example, is that Shinran is trying to demonstrate that within the Pure Land Sutras, the one vehicle philosophy is fully there, right, from a different perspective. Also, Shinran, of the many texts that he quotes the Avatamsaka Sutra a lot. He even gives the Avatamsaka Sutra the last word in the Jodo Shinshu. That's not insignificant, right? So these interconnections of diversity and unity, that's an interesting philosophical issue right there. So this is fresh in my mind. I could do a whole thing on that right now. But anyway, so these are some things that I've been kind of working on, and that's fun. And yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe we'll take one more. Isabel writes quite a lot of feedback, makes it difficult to hear. Everyone who's not speaking, please turn off your microphone. I think that's probably me. I didn't mute myself in time. Sorry about that. So we'll move on to Eric Hammerstrom. Thanks very much for your talk. This is a great corrective to how Mahayana or Pure Land are still commonly portrayed. It is very compelling. Part of the argument here seems to be to say that Pure Land is also early. I wonder, though, how much does Shin Buddhism require historicity as a form of legitimation?
I think that some of the people that Dr. Curley was dealing with were really concerned with that issue in particular. Okay, if and this is a whole discourse in modern Japan, well, if Shakyamuni didn't teach the Mahayana, what do we do, right? And I don't really have a good answer to that question, because I think that there's a balancing act between historicity as a form of legitimation, but also the fact that there's just a lot we don't know, right? One of my nerdy side hobbies is to look at how Christian theologians and scholars of the New Testament talk about the Gospels. What do they really know about what Jesus said or didn't say? What is the text critical history of these texts, and what can you reasonably say, what can you not say? And they're struggling with similar issues of, what is the earliest one? Well, it's probably Mark. Okay, why do we think that? Which one's the latest? Well, it's probably John. Why do we think that? And what Christologies come out of that, right? Historicity as a legitimizing force is such a prominent part of Christian New Testament studies and other areas of concern. And in the modern period, there was that problem with, does Shinran even exist? Did the Buddha even exist? And how to answer and how to deal with those problems is also about adapting a tradition to these new modes of thinking about what is history, right? What really happened, and I think that also a lot of scholars now want to, I think, push for the legitimacy of earlier forms of knowing, that we don't have to peg it all, here's when it really happened. They can say, well, there's another dynamic going on, because those people didn't know with any real certainty, and having this world full of magic and gods was kind of the worldview, and there's something powerful in that is worthy of investigation on its own without having to, So.
Yeah, I think, and just to touch on that, I think one of the interesting things is that when Honen Shonin established the Jodoshu as a independent school, there's two things that he had to do. He had to cite what was the konkyo, like the fundamental text that he was using as the basis. So that became the Pure Land Sutras. He also had to identify his connection of the lineage back to Shakyamuni Buddha, right? And that's what I think Jodo Shinshu as well with Shinran had to kind of do, is to create that lineage that tied back to the original historical Buddha. And I think this ties in with something that I kind of want to ask you about later on today, was that there's a lot of emphasis from these Orientalist scholars who are talking about going back to an original source, the original Shakyamuni Buddha. But I think maybe Buddhism might be talking about the emphasis of going the other way, as opposed to going back in the history of time. How did it emanate out? And so in that sense, the lineage, or pointing out the lineage of the seven masters, kind of plays into that part as legitimizing the teaching of Shinshu doctrine, possibly. Yeah.
And I think also, again, in kind of thinking of this spiritual judo, we want that certainty. That's like a drive. Like, I want to know, when did it really happen? What really happened? Like, what is my true self? What happens after it? And then the Buddhist tradition also provides these useful tools like shunyata, or emptiness, that the constructs we enforce upon the world are actually fluid, and you can deconstruct them, and maybe don't get too attached to that type of stuff, in the end. But in thinking about, opponents' establishment of Jodo Shu as kind of its own thing, I think one of the things I think is really interesting is, who else he references for legitimation. Like, just like Kukai was talking about this esoteric stuff, how he divided into exoteric and esoteric. I'm going to talk about, Pure Land and the Path of Sages, or whatever it was in the preface there. So again, it's still this interconnected environment where he's having to respond to all these different claims and kind of legitimate what he's doing, in that particular way. Anyway.